As President of the Australian National University Alumni Network in the UK and Europe, I'm delighted to welcome you all here this evening. Alumni, friends and staff of the Australian National University, Oxford University and the International Alliance of Research Universities. And as lovely as it is to see you here this evening, we're here because we have to do a job, and that is to make a difference to the world through our education. As Mr. Trump and Mr. Kim Jong-un have bumped chest in Singapore this week, and our G7 leaders have wandered home, perhaps scratching their heads, we might feel a little bit bemused. But some of us would be thinking the importance of the exchange of knowledge, equity, and understanding the merits of diversity are more important than ever. In fact, we might be saying that the world is in the balance. No pressure, alum. But many of us have benefited from an education and the sacrifices of our parents to give that to us, scholarships that we've been offered, and the job opportunities we have been given to access higher education. But as we all know, surrounding us were people who believed in higher education and provided us the support to attain it. And as we now know, there are many young people who do not have that support. And indeed, if they did have that support, who knows what their achievements might be. Well, tonight we have the opportunity to listen to our thought leaders, and they are going to talk about the ways we can and are improving access to equity, access to higher education and the equity that that provides, and also its outcomes. By understanding the barriers to education and really to its successes, our universities, by collaborating, are really overcoming these barriers. And now tonight I would like to introduce you to our guest speakers. Professor Marnie Hughes-Warrington, Deputy Vice-Chancellor Academic, Lord Macdonald, QC, Warden of Wadham College, and Nicholas Miller, Chief Executive of the Bridge Group and partner of More Partnerships. Professor Marnie Hughes-Warrington has responsibility for education activities across the university. Her responsibilities range from e-learning and curriculum innovation to education philanthropy and student fees, urban education environment developments, and really realising the potential of students and staff alike. At the ANU, she's introduced the globally innovative, flexible double degree system, and the one that I've been hearing about tonight from our alumni, which we're all very excited about, is the Accommodation, Scholarships and Admissions ASA initiative, a pivot for our students nationally to enter higher education. She is an active researcher with 7 books published, $18 million in grants, and about to produce her 8th book. And this will be on the relationship between ethics and scales of history. She has been a key driver in the development of the $106 million Tuckwell program and is the 5th and first female secretary of the Rhodes Scholarships in Australia in 114 years. In 2008, she was recognised with the Australian Prime Minister's Award for the University Teacher of the Year, and in 2016, she was made Principal Fellow of the Higher Education Academy. Ken Macdonald, QC, became Warden of Wadham College in 2012, and prior to his arrival at Oxford, has practiced at the bar since 1978 and taking his silk in 1997. He's a founding member of Matrix Chambers, and he was appointed a Recorder of the Crown Court in 2001 and elected Chairman of the Criminal Bar Association in 2003. Later that year, he became Director of Public Prosecutions, the DPP, the first prominent defence lawyer to have been appointed to the post. As DPP, he established the Counter-Terrorism Division, the Organised Crime Division, the Special Crime Division, and the Fraud Prosecution Service. He played a major role across Whitehall in the development of criminal justice policy, especially in relation to international treaties and judicial issues, mutual legal assistance, extradition, terrorism, and grave cross-border crime. He's chair of Reprieve, the anti-death penalty organisation, and in 2015, he was appointed Chair of the Council for the prestigious Orwell Prize for Political Writing. And Nick Miller. He is passionate about access, which we'll see tonight, and social mobility, and fundraising to support it. He is, as I mentioned, Chief Executive of the Bridge Group and partner of the Moore Partnership. And prior to these appointments, he's worked in the USA, at the University of Warwick, and most recently, Director of Corporate and Alumni Relations at the University of York. And talking to Nick earlier, he's had extensive work experience and input to both Wadham College and the ANU. He has advised the Cabinet Office on social mobility and collaborated with multinational organisations to promote fairer access to the professions, including Google and Goldman. He has recently been a consultant to KPMG, the Wellcome Trust, the BBC and Clifford Chance. Nick is an experienced fundraiser, and he has secured millions of pounds from charities, businesses and major philanthropists to support social mobility. He has spoken at international conferences and is regularly commissioned to write for leading publications. He's also a research fellow at the University of York and a trustee of the Unite Foundation, which distributed over 8 million to care leavers in higher education, and a founding member of the CASE Research Committee. So tonight it promises to be a really exciting night with Nick leading the panel, get my words around the right way, and we really look forward to this evening. Thanks. Over to you.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Chantal. I think our microphones will magically come on. Thank you very much. If you ever have the great pleasure of being on a stage like this with two people who are much more eminent than yourself, can I advise you to make sure your biography features first rather than third in the pecking order? I found myself feeling rather nervous there. Thank you, Chantal, for a wonderful introduction, and of course to ANU and the efforts from Wadham to put together this evening. We promise to make the topic of social inequality as engaging and upbeat as possible. I think tonight's a really pertinent and important opportunity to reflect on one of the most important policy issues of our time. In the UK, we hear a lot about how talent and hard work are enough and all you need to get ahead. And of course, as Marnie and I were discussing earlier, modern Australia has a long history of being a land of opportunity and has its foundations built on the concept of social mobility. But the reality is, of course, in both countries, inequality is on the rise, not on the decline. And in the UK, the link between the circumstances into which you were born and your adult outcomes is stronger than in almost any other developed country. And let me tell you, as a country, you have to work pretty hard to be top of that particular league table. And one of the consequences of this, just to give a bit of sort of backdrop to the conversation that will unfold, is at least in the UK, and I know Marnie's going to reflect on the context in Australia, one of the symptoms of this appears to be really intense declines in public trust about the system, about government, about media, about big business, and the lack of diversity in the sorts of institutions that shape the future of our country. So on that slightly opening bleak note, it's against this backdrop, of course, that we'll kick off tonight's discussion about the role of universities in that context. Should we expect university to be bastions of equality, for education to be the engine of social mobility? And is there a risk indeed that some of our most selective universities come to be exemplars of those institutions which are for the few and not for the many? So I think tonight's a fantastic opportunity to hear two, as Chantal was saying, thoughtful and passionate perspectives, to look across continents and learn. Certainly in the UK, we're often very introspective when we think about these matters, to talk about key issues, but also, I know, about practical solutions as well. And an opportunity, of course, to get your voice heard. So just a brief word on format before I hand over to Marnie. We'll invite Marnie and Ken to offer some opening remarks, and as soon as Ken has finished, we'll throw it open to the audience. So the threat is that if you're not an engaged audience that contributes questions, I will work industriously through my own. So you have been warned. Marnie, the stage is yours.
So I have a very simple message, which is that the best gift is the one that gets you to think and to act differently. 5 years ago, Graham and Louise Tuckwell decided that they would give us $50 million to start a scholarship scheme at ANU because we were the national university. We're the only national university in Australia, and they saw us as serving the nation. And so we said, yes, absolutely, we can step up to the plate and we will do that. And we'll offer 25 scholarships per year for students to come to ANU. And in the first year, 650 students applied for that scholarship, and it then ramped up to 750, 800 scholarship applicants per year for 25 scholarships. What was profound about that was that we began to revisit who the nation was through that process. The gift allowed a small number of people to come, but we began to see data on who our applicants were, and we began to re-understand who it was we could engage with across the country. And not only that, looking at the applications, we decided that we will go on the road. So the Deputy Vice-Chancellor would go on the road and meet students and their families across every state and territory in Australia. So starting in Tasmania, where I'm from, I'm a first in family, to go to university, where some schools have fewer than 10% of students completing with a tertiary eligible package, through to the Northern Territory, where nobody in living memory has gone in their family to university. So getting on the road, meeting grandparents right down to 3-year-olds, the whole family coming along and talking and telling us what the university looked like to them and what a university was. And meeting a lot of particularly working poor people who felt that we were not serving them at all. In fact, we had no relationship to them. They'd never heard of us. Some of us didn't know where Canberra was. That's the capital city. In Australia, they were not sure about us at all. They questioned our motives. And so we collected the data over 5 years. And that, I think, gave us the sense that we could be far more courageous about who we were and begin to revisit our mission as the National University. So we started looking at the data, 3,500 applications over 5 years. And we could see that there were students across Australia that had both the desire to go to university, they had the grades, and they engaged in co-curriculum activities. They had hobbies, they contributed, they had part-time work. They were doing all these things that we were not measuring through admissions. And so we decided, we said, right, what if we were to rebuild admissions from scratch? Treat it as a research project and look at the data. So we did research on how you could possibly admit somebody into a university, and we looked across the world. What mechanisms are people using to admit students, and what evidence exists to support those choices? And we could see that there's good research to suggest that GPA, or performance at high school, is probably one of the best indicators of performance at university. Okay, one of the best. But there were other things people were doing that had no relationship to performance. So some universities were asking people for photographs when they applied, and there was no correlation with performance. And so we said, let's have a look. And at the same time, we asked the National Curriculum Authority, can we have a look at the data for student outcomes across Australia? Can we have a look at what students are aspiring to study? And there is no national admission platform in Australia like there is in the UK. There's no UCAS. There's 5 different tertiary admission centre. There's no national data set. And here, the only federal university is fighting a battle to get access to data to look at students across Australia. So we looked at that data, and then the quiet revolution began. 2 years, 20 technical papers, 236,000 data points from the Curriculum Authority, 90,000 data points from the University Admissions Centre, 3,500 applications from Tuckwell, and we decided to rebuild admissions. And we did it in 3 different ways. The first thing we decided to do was to develop a single platform for accommodation, admissions and scholarships for students. They should not have to run around to ask for money, to ask for a bed, because moving away from home, you need a lot of support. You need somebody to say, here's a scholarship, without you asking for it, without you holding out your hand, because a lot of equity students don't think they're deserving. So we need to take that away and actually just give them the support that they need. The second thing that we thought that we needed to do was actually revisit our national role. And so the second part of the admissions reform is that from next year we'll be making an offer to the top 3 students from every school in Australia. Why top 3? And the top 10% on academic performance. So the strong schools still perform well, but the top 3. We started looking at the data. If you make an offer to the top 1 student in every school across your country, you'll find high income students. You go to the top 2 students and you find Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander students. You go to the third and you find low income students. You have to go that deep to find them and make an offer to them. So rather than expect them to know where Canberra is and to know who we are, we reach out to the school and say, your top 3 are eligible. And you know what? 85% of students across Australia meet our academic requirements. So it's not an absence of aspiration or attainment. It's there. It needs encouragement. And it needs us to walk towards the students rather than them walk towards us. In order to help make sure that they have the qualifications to have a broad range of access to degrees, we've said that from 2022, maths and English will be compulsory for all applicants to ANU. Now, some of you who are ANU graduates are now probably having deep breathing at this point. Is there anybody here who didn't do maths at high school? There's always one or two, exactly, right, and now you're feeling
I'm proud.
Yeah, you're probably feeling anxious at this point. This is the point where everybody starts saying, oh gosh, will I get into ANU? And I go, relax, you already got in, it's okay. You graduated, it's fine. And whoever's coming in 2022 has now got 3 years' notice to do any form of mathematics and any form of English, because neither is compulsory across Australia. Neither. And we know that mathematics is the key to getting kids into STEM degrees, and that English is absolutely a necessity for achieving at university, and yet neither of those things is compulsory. So we're doing that. And then finally we've said, right, all those things they do outside the classroom, co-curriculum, all that energy they pour into doing those things, we'd like to capture that. But we're not asking people to write personal statements, and we're not doing interviews. What we have done is published a schedule and said, we want it to count. It matters that you do those things. We just want you to get 3 points. And you can get 3 points from having a part-time job or being a carer for your family member. Going in a maths competition, volunteering, leading, all those amazing things that students do that are completely hidden to us in Australia at the moment because we judge a person on one academic percentile ranking. So that's a requirement too. So that starts next year. What we're trying to do is to signal that it's not just academic attainment, the ability is there. We need the reach out, we need the financial support to help students there, but importantly with that co-curriculum we need to signal that university is not a limited good, it's actually a generous good. People are generous to their families and their schools and their communities, and we should recognise that when people come into university. We should encourage them to continue doing that during their studies. We know it's an indicator for employability, it's important, but we hope that they will feel through that experience that they will be generous and help support the next generation come along. So we need to build that generous good. And that's important for combating the notion that a little university like ours is only going to be for a tiny number of people. But if I admit people that are generous to their family, community and school, I'm not just admitting a tiny number of people, I'm admitting a number of people who are helping other people. So the reach of the university is back into those communities and will be judged on serving those communities. So it starts next year. The reception so far has been fascinating. According to The Australian, we're elitist. According to The Guardian, we're engaged in the greatest act of social equity Australia's ever seen. And I think the truth lies somewhere in the middle. And I'll stop there. Ken, over to you.
Marnie, thank you.
Well, I think it sounds tremendously impressive, and on a very ambitious scale. I think that's a good thing. I think it's good to be ambitious, and it's good to push the boundaries further than many of the people advising you think you ought to. I think that's a good thing to do. It's a good thing to be dragging young people by the scruff of the neck and pulling them up, even if in doing that you're putting them past some people who in traditional terms have more school attainment. That's inevitable. You have to accept that that's part of this process. You have to accept that when you're looking at young people from very different schools, one young person who gets an A and 2 Bs in school A is quite, which is an underachieving sink school, is quite capable of being far more brilliant, has far more potential than someone who gets 3 As from an expensive private school. And these are inequalities that we have to confront vigorously, and it causes some pain. I mean, I have lots of conversations at dinner parties in North London with people who say to me, my child didn't get into Oxford because you only take kids from state schools, and I say, and that's social engineering and it's unfair discrimination. My response usually is, we've been unfairly discriminating in favour of private schools since time immemorial, and what we're trying to do is create a level playing field and enable everyone, every young person who has the right commitment and the right ability, and that's not always to be judged, as you've said, by what they've attained at school. In fact, we don't do what you do and take into account extracurricular activities particularly, but we do look at what we perceive to be the potential of students, and sometimes that means seeing past strict attainment. So when we interview students in Oxford, the colleges, the admissions tutors have available to them not just the school results, the school reports, the personal statement, and the entrance exam results. They also have what we call the contextual materials. So the tutors will have material about, for example, the number of free school meals at a particular school, whether the candidate comes from a single parent family, information about postcodes indicating what part of town they come from. Oxford is a collegiate university, so it's made up of 30 colleges and some private halls, and the process is uneven across the university. In my college, my sense is, and I'm sure this is the case, the tutors pay close attention to the contextual material, very close attention. I think in some other colleges, less attention is paid to it. It's too easy, if you're a college at Oxford, simply to cream off the cleverest young men and women from the very best private schools who have been coached brilliantly to pass exams and to do well in interviews and to do reasonably well when they get to university. It's far more challenging to take risks and to try and find those young people from less propitious backgrounds who have equal or even greater ability and who will do as well or better when they arrive in Oxford. My college, as it happens, by culture and inclination, is a college which is inclined to that work and has done it for many, many years. Our mission really is to demonstrate that increasing fairness in the admissions process and increasing diversity amongst the student body is not about lowering the bar, as many people suggest when you begin to engage them on this agenda. Oh, but you'll have to lower the admission requirements to take these kids. It's not about that at all. In fact, what happens is that when you widen the pool, when you select more fairly, more broadly, and with more information of the sort that I've been describing, you drive up academic standards. In the late 1940s, Wadham had a very famous warden, a man called Maurice Bowrer, and he asked a simple question, which is, why is this college taking those young men from, it was all men in those days, all those young men from the great public schools who aren't clever enough to get into Merton or Magdalen or New College? Why don't we go to the grammar schools, the state schools, and take their cleverest young men? And that's what he did. And the result, of course, was that the scholastic standards of the college increased. And we now have a college with one of the most diverse student bodies of any college in Oxford, but also one of the highest achieving student bodies. So we rank over the last 5 or 6 years, we average about fifth place out of 38 colleges and halls in the Norrington table, with an exceptionally diverse student body. It's already been hinted at, and it's obviously the case that alienation and marginalisation are spreading across the world. There are all sorts of reasons for this. I mean, in so-called developed countries. Certainly in my country, levels of marginalisation and alienation are very high and not getting any lower. And we've all seen in recent years what the price is, and it's a high one. It's been a very high price to pay in the United Kingdom, and we're grappling with that price at the moment. But it's absolutely essential, it seems to me, that educational institutions of tertiary education, think about social mobility and take steps to play a role, which they have in driving social mobility. It's absolutely critical that these institutions, which can do so much for young people and which consume so much public money, distribute their wares, if you like, fairly. None of us believes, no one in this room believes that intelligence is an accident of birth or a function of wealth. It's a preposterous notion to conclude that only those young people who come from wealthier or better off families have the ability to get into university. We all know that's obviously a foolish and untrue notion. The question is, how do we respond to that realization? If we don't respond, we're simply complicit, it seems to be, in a fiction which is deeply damaging politically and socially and economically. And above all, we're responsible for being complicit in an extraordinary waste of human potential. Because every young person we miss, every young person that we fail to encourage is one lost. So we work at Wadham not just with people who are on the brink of admission to university. We've developed a revolutionary for Oxford programme working with people who are under the age of 16, raising their aspirations, raising their levels of interest, raising their levels of attainment, and then tracking them through the school system. So we run events at the schools, we run master classes, we bring them up to Oxford for a couple of days, give them tutorials, lectures, invite them to write essays, get them to give presentations. And overwhelmingly, the response of these young people when they come is that I hadn't realised that this was what Oxford was. Because the first thing they see when they get to Wadham is they look around and they see people who look exactly like them. And that's the first battle. The second battle is to give them the confidence that these places are not just for boys and girls from expensive schools. We had a school party up recently from Luton, and a group of them, they were 13, 14-year-olds were leaving, and one of our college porters, who happened to be in the entrance to the college when they left, said to me there were two young women leaving, two young Muslim women, and one said to the other, two girls, 13, 14 years old, one said to the other, oh, I'm really sorry to be leaving, and the other turned to her and said, I'm not leaving, I'm coming back. And that's exactly where we want to be. Exactly where we want to be. So I hope that you'll support your university and the work that it's doing as our alumni support us. We find that the easiest topic to enthuse our alumni about is this topic. The easiest way to encourage them to retain an involvement and an interest in the college, to help us financially but in other ways, is to speak to them about the work we're doing in this area, because everybody recognises its importance. So I hope that you too, I can ask you directly because Marnie's too polite to, but do support the university in every way that you can in this work. It's so important. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your reflections. Two very positive messages I picked up on there. Marnie, your opening narrative about evidence, and you didn't use the word transparency, but I think that was underneath a lot of what you were saying, and the data. It seems to me admissions generally is barren of evidence, here in the UK at least. And Ken, your reflections on diversity driving up standards is not a message we hear often from our politicians. This narrative is usually rooted in either, we need to help young people from poor backgrounds, or it's rooted in the economy. I think very rarely is it rooted in the educational advantages of driving up standards, of having a richer educational experience at Oxford, which diversity brings. I will resist the urge to fire questions myself, at least for the moment. We have a microphone here, and if I could encourage colleagues to use it just for the advantage of folk who might not be sat close to you. If you could just give us your name and your question, that would be perfect. If I may, I'll take two or three at once. Thank you.
Ian Dodds. I want to, the present government is actually trying to encourage grammar schools. Now, I grew up on a council estate with a working class family and was fortunate enough to go to Wadham College. And the thing about a grammar school was that being good at something really counted, so that I was always top of the year, and so I was in the in crowd. My friends were captain of the football team, captain of the cricket team, and I didn't have to dumb myself down. Yet my guess is if I'd gone to a comprehensive school, because I was a geeky kid, I would have had to dumb myself down. Now, I've got very mixed views about grammar schools, but what's the view?
Thank you. Let's take one more question, if I may. Thanks. Safe Chantal reaching.
So I'm Sally Wheeler. I'm currently employed, much to my amazement, by the ANU.
Don't say it out loud.
So I think anyone who knows me knows that.
You.
So I was a first-generation university goer at Oxford, and it was a deeply alienating experience. And I just wanted to know what both speakers thought about the structures that would be needed in order to build social capital for students that come through on those sorts of pathways. Not all students need that, but my experience would be that if they are to make the best of those opportunities, they need quite a lot of support at university on an ongoing basis.
Okay, let's just take one more question if we may. There's a gentleman towards the back. Thank you, Julie.
Robert McCorkadale. Marnie, I think what you're doing at ANU is a fabulous step forward. But for both of you, both universities, actually, there's a big focus on research students. And you've both looked at just the undergraduate process. But in fact, ANU has a cap on undergraduates. Oxford has a fairly strong limit on undergraduates. What are you proposing to do in terms of social diversity beyond that? Because they're a large percentage of your students, and I don't hear that being mentioned at all. I have one other slight point, which is also in terms of partly picking up what Sally's saying, the process of focus so much on kind of exams as a method of assessment is also a concern in terms of diversity.
Okay, so I think we've got one question here which is about sort of what happens prior to the access agenda that you were discussing around the virtues or otherwise of grammar schools. Should I turn to Ken initially for some reflections on that?
So if, I don't know if all the audience will know, the system in the UK used to be that school pupils were tested at age 11. If they did an exam called the 11 plus, if they passed, they went to a grammar school. If they failed, they went to a secondary modern. Grammar schools were academic, secondary moderns were basically technical, and schooling finished at 15 or then 16 when it was raised. I went to a grammar school in a small country town in southern England. Grammar schools, some people now say, were engines of social mobility. I can tell you that with very, very few exceptions, I'm talking about 1 or 2 people per class, all the middle class kids went to the grammar schools, and all the working class kids, with some exceptions, went to the secondary moderns. And it may have been different in other towns, it may have been different in big cities, but my experience was that there was no social mobility whatsoever. In fact, quite the opposite. Kids from a certain socioeconomic background were shunted into an inferior educational system, and that's why we brought in comprehensives, which have had mixed success, but at least do not divide children up at such an early age. So I am not a supporter of grammar schools. I think it's a retrogressive and reactionary agenda, and I think that such evidence as there is demonstrates that grammar schools were not engines of social mobility. Grammar schools, by and large, educated the middle classes, and the working classes were educated in secondary moderns. That was my own experience, and I think it's a pretty widespread one.
Yeah, I think the national research backs up your evidence as well, and I think partly it's about postcode as well and the ability to live close to a school. I was on stage a few weeks ago with Justine Greening, who of course one might argue lost her job in the cabinet as a result of opposing the Prime Minister's grammar school agenda, and I think everything you've just said, Ken, is right. Then there was a theme emerging, I think, about sort of what happens after access. What responsibility do we then inherit to making sure students all can thrive regardless of background, and how does that then translate into postgraduate and research study? Marnie, some thoughts on those topics?
I can answer your question very easily, Robert. I'm only just starting, okay? So you can bet your bottom dollar that this is a starting point. We had to start somewhere, and we thought it was very clearly the case, given how predominantly domestic our undergraduate program is, that our mission as the National University would very strongly signalled by this Act. But I am very interested in international students and graduate students. And also there's an interesting question there about doctoral students who are selected typically purely on academic activities, and that's treated as a limited good. But actually, if you look at the research around retention in doctoral studies, it's often sociability, getting involved in the community, actually going to the seminars is a better predictor of success and retention than just academic grades. We lose an awful lot of people that drop out of doctorates unnecessarily because they actually don't get themselves connected into the department, and that's both on our side and on the student side. So I don't know that we're signalling up front quite everything that's needed in that doctoral space. Having said that, doctoral studies is not in my bailiwick, but that's my personal view. To go back to Sally's point, I think it's a really important one. It's actually a general question. Who is ready for university and who's not? Now, I don't think that's just an income question for students. When we were talking about this model with the university, people would say, well, what are we going to do when these underprepared students turn up? And I'd say, what do you mean by underprepared? Are you using those scare quotes because you're talking about poor people and you're just not brave enough to use that word? And they go, no, I mean underprepared students. And I go, oh, really? Okay, well, who are they? Okay, tell me who they are. And so we ran a statistical report to see who was dropping out of the university. And we said, actually, the group that's most likely to drop out at the moment are boys from private schools. In the mid-range, who've had a lot of support at school, turn up to university and are lost. Right? We need to help that group too. So I've said, actually, it's not about saying that, you know, underprepared people need their own building or their own Oxford College. I notice that's being talked about. Oxford needs more colleges for underprepared people. I'm going, well, let's put them in a ghetto and see how that works. That's not going to work, right?
I agree.
My assumption is that everybody probably needs more support going to university. It's not a transition that's actually easy for many people. And so my assumption is we should be doing this for everyone. So we talked about alumni who are wonderful. Now, we noticed when we were looking at research on admissions that in the US, alumni do interviews up front. And we thought that's a really interesting model. We don't want to put alumni in the position of screening people. But what we did do this year was trialled and piloted what we will do under the new model next year, which is alumni do welcome phone calls. So after the student's been there, the offer, the alumni picks up the phone and says, how are you doing? What are you really worried about? Okay? That's important for us because there was a big piece of work done in Australia last year which showed that applicants to university trust the university information least of all. So our websites and our brochures are the least trusted sources of information for students making decisions around going to university. There are other points of trust, which is, you know, please tell me how this place works. What do I need to bring with me? Do I need a washing basket? I can't actually cook. What do I do? How do I navigate this place? Everybody needs that help. Everybody. And then when you do get to university, so we're residential, so 75% of our first year are now living on campus. We have a ratio of 1 to 20 a senior student in residence with those other students. And their job is to knock on the door of those students every day. How are you doing? What can I help you with? So those of you who've been to ANU, if you lived in residence, you will remember the senior residents. They are a critical part of this. How are you doing? What's the problem? There's peer support, and we think that's actually critical for helping everybody that needs that support and transition. I'm a first-in family too, Sally, so I went to University of Tasmania. I went from a school where 10% of students go to university. And then I went to Oxford as well. I went to Merton, Kent. And I thought I'd landed on Mars, to be honest with you.
To be fair, you had.
But I actually think it was one of the most transformational experiences. And people say, well, how lucky you went to Oxford, how transformational. I said, it's true. But actually that first degree in Tasmania probably is where the transformation started.
I mean, I think this is a really important question about what happens when you arrive, particularly if you're making it your business to try and find young people who are coming from backgrounds which are heavily unrepresented. It's not such a problem for us because our college has a diverse student body, so when the people from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, for example, arrive, there are plenty of other people around them like that. And so it's not quite the same as going to a more traditional college. But I think one of the reasons that our students tend to do well academically is not just because we pick bright ones, not just because we go further and deeper than most colleges, but because we have very well-developed support mechanisms and systems for students when they arrive. And I agree with what you're saying, Stephanie. Most students need support and assistance of some sort. So we have very developed welfare systems. We have a college parenting system. So every student, new undergraduate that arrives, is given a college parent who's a student who's just gone into the second year, who kind of looks up, watches out for them, and they go to for advice. And that's an extensive and very popular program. So I think you're right, and I think it works. The attrition rate is very, very low. Certainly in Wadham, and I think in Oxford generally, it's very, very low. I mean, I think it's sort of 1 or 2%. Do you know what it is, Martin? It's very, very low. About 1 or 2%. Yeah. I'd be surprised as much as 4%, but it's very low. But I think in the past, you know, we dragged up these kids and just dumped them in a very, very unfamiliar environment, and I think it caused a lot of unhappiness. On the graduate point, this is quite tricky. So what we've done in recent years is to fundraise for graduate scholarships. It's very expensive to endow a graduate scholarship in perpetuity. Costs about £1 million. So for every scholarship that we want to endow, we have to raise £1 million, and that's a lot of money. I think about 60% of our graduate students are funded, but most of them are science students. And the real problem is in the social sciences to an extent, but much more in the humanities. Funding for humanities graduate students is rock bottom in the UK. And so we've raised some money for that, but I would say that the majority of our graduate students in the humanities are self-funding. So the one-year students are getting bank loans, and I think if they're doing PhDs, they're probably coming from backgrounds, they have parents who can help to support them. So there's a real issue about the intake into these programs. And when we're recruiting students from abroad, I think it's even more the case, because the expense involved in coming from abroad to do a humanities DPhil in Oxford is enormous. So the real risk is that it's not just a risk, I think in reality we are largely recruiting those people who can afford to spend 3 years living in Oxford, and they can afford it because they come from comfortable socioeconomic backgrounds. Obviously that's a problem, and we've been focused on undergraduates because we are a UK university. We have a public responsibility to educate young Brits as well as people from other countries, but we have a responsibility to young British people of all backgrounds to bring them into the college, and so our focus is on that. And I don't see any easy answer to the funding problem for humanities MPhils and DPhils. I think it's a really tricky one because, as I say, funding them is incredibly expensive. We'd have to raise 60-70 million pounds to fund the people in our college who are doing humanities MPhils and DPhils, and our total endowment is about 90, so we'd have to double our endowment effectively to do that, and that's just not going to happen. So it's a pretty intractable problem. It's probably the same for you.
Yeah, it's true. Although some donors are actually very interested in humanities, which is terrific for us. And again, endowing graduate, we're very happy for people to support students at all levels.
Yeah.
Interestingly, a lot of donors want to talk about the undergraduate space because, as we say, you can see a clear transformation from somebody who's come from 4 generations of welfare dependency, and suddenly you're giving that person the chance to come to university. The research is pretty good that the health, economic and social outcomes for that individual and their family, we say that is the best early preventative medicine you could invest in. And we say we spend a lot on healthcare research, a lot on helping people to stay out of the criminal justice system. Actually, we have one of the cheapest solutions, which is to get people into education.
Yes, a lot cheaper than prison.
It's a lot cheaper than prison.
That's your fundraising strapline, Marnie?
Well, from a nation that was former convict, actually,
They sound convinced.
We've already been there.
I wonder, just to sort of extrapolate on Sally's point a bit, Marnie, you mentioned in your opening statement about engaging parents of young people, and I wonder if you can just expand on that a bit, because presumably one of the risks here is that you, and I'll exaggerate to make my point, you extract young people from their home communities and cultures, immerse them in the wonderful experiences at ANU, and parents actually can often feel alienated. Can you talk a bit more about the work with parents that you're doing?
Absolutely. Look, wherever we go, we always run multiple events. We meet with principals, we meet with careers advisors, because we want to make sure careers advisors give good advice to students. So we've had a case where our first Indigenous medical graduate was told she should be a cleaner, right? And so you are doing the work of working with that people and say you're really invaluable in helping direct students to set the highest possible goals. And then we have open sessions, and anybody can come. And it could be, for instance, I've met grandparents who basically said, look, I borrowed money to get petrol to drive here today, to bring my grandchild, whom I've got custody of, because the parents are not able to look after them. Mum and dad might come. We always get a student to talk, but then about 3 years ago, we decided to ask parents to talk. And it's an interesting one in Australia, because most universities are, well, actually, they're generally not residential. They're set in cities, people live at home, they go to university and they go back home at the end of the day. So there's an invisibility about parents and family in universities in Australia. And so we thought, you know, instead of ignoring that group, we should actually bring them in. So we started asking parents to talk at those sessions. And I have sat through sessions where, you know, parents have stood up and they've just been in tears, talking about the fact that they desperately want the best for their children, but they don't know what that is because they actually have never had the benefit of a university education. And they're placing their trust in you, and they want to build that trust. So I'll be going back to Townsville about 3 weeks from now, and this will be the 6th year they'll have been in Townsville. And they love it when you come back. You can't just fly into a town, expect people to have a relationship with you and then just walk away from that. You have to keep going. And people start doing baking. They actually start, the whole family comes along. You end up on the local radio station. You become it's actually a big thing. And people say, universities never come to our town. Australia's a really big place. You have to go out to people, and they will drive big distances and they will come because they want the best for their children. Now, sometimes young people don't have the benefit of a family upbringing that they would want, and they have to deal with things that young people shouldn't have to deal with. So they may be an orphan, they may have incredible instability in their family lives, and our view is if we can help that student get to a stable environment in university where they've got a place to live, they're not homeless, they've got food to eat, their performance will go through the roof because they're probably performing pretty well under extraordinarily difficult circumstances. So there's not always a family supporting that person, or there may be tensions and issues in that family where the student's living out and there's complexities in there. But I tell you what, it teaches you to humanise universities, to go from thinking that a young person is just one number or 2 grades to actually saying that person is bringing all of those complexities, and if we are to support that group of people, we have to have a good appreciation of what those complexities are when they walk through the door, basically. So I actually think the trick for us was actually the day we started to give parents a voice and to speak on and to talk to other parents and to say, this is the doubt I'm going through, this is the problem. Other parents will believe those parents more than they will believe me.
Noted.
Yeah. Well, also, I'm from Tasmania too. Yeah, and in Australia, you know, you go to Queensland, they say, you're from Tasmania, what would you know?
Got it. Colleagues, more questions, please. We're just trying to relocate the microphone. Julie, thank you. There's a question. Yeah, thank you.
Sure, thanks. Will Jenkins. So I'll go straight for Marnie, if I may. First, you've crunched the numbers, lots of upsides. What are the downsides?
Yeah.
What are the risks there? First of all, and second of all, we agree the ambition's great. What's next? Is it G8 taking something similar, or what's the long-term plan?
Okay. Yeah, sure.
Thanks. Well, let's just take a couple more and then we'll... Thank you.
Yeah, I guess also on the data, you mentioned that you like to look at the top 3 students. It might be early days, but I'm just wondering if there's been any tracking for how those top 3 students perform when they actually reach university, whether they continue to be ranked 1, 2, 3, or whether there's a bit of a switch around.
Okay, thank you. And then Richard, just a couple of rows back.
Hi there, I'm Richard Gould. I work for a social mobility charity called Villas Park Educational Trust. Fascinated and really interested in your 3 kids from each school, and based on the fact that the Oxbridge system has linked areas that each college works with, I think there's an opportunity there to pilot something that could be really interesting. I've just got a couple of questions about how that process works. I'm not sure how many secondary schools there are in Australia, but what percentage of the total intake of your university actually come through from that method? And then the second question is, to what extent are you involving the schools in the process of both working with the students on their journey towards being in the top 3 and also selecting them in the first place as well?
So risks of the data, some of the potentially negative effects of being transparent and digging in the data, and then I think just some more detailed questions about the process and methodology, and of course what's next, I think was at the start of your question.
Sure. Look, the greatest risk I think is the one you've alluded to. Transparency is a big deal now in Australia, so our failures are there for everybody to see. So you can put the model out there and students across Australia say, we categorically reject you. I'm holding out my hand, I want you to come, and they'll say, go away. Right, so there is no guarantee that a student from a local school will want to come to our university. I can't pretend that we're the most attractive option for people. That's the greatest risk, is that you suddenly turn up saying, I know everything and I know you, and you've got to be so careful that you're not speaking on behalf of that person and taking away their choice, when all this is about is actually saying every student in Australia should have more than one choice, or they should have the choice to go to university. In terms of response, it's interesting. So on the maths and English side, it's interesting, the Minister for Education, Will, came out last week and said every university should do this. Stand up and actually make English and maths a requirement. Okay? Nobody's beating a path to that door yet, but it's interesting, school principals have said to me, thank you for doing that, because they are frustrated with students not taking maths. And they've said, finally, you have dealt us a hand that allows us, because there's no national curriculum in Australia at all. And maths is not a compulsory requirement anywhere, and English is compulsory in some constituencies, and in some constituencies you can just do a half an hour test to see whether you've got adequate English skills in lieu of doing English. So the schools have actually been very pleased. They said this is a public policy stance. But there's a risk there too. There'll be some people who say, I don't want to do maths, I'm not going to uni. That's fine, I can live with the downside. There is a risk that you go through all of this and you don't change. So we actually need the help of our alumni and our community and that transparency to hold us to account. And so it's enough to declare the ambition, but you have to absolutely follow through. And that's the next step, is hold us to account. Because it's now a requirement by law in Australia to say who you're taking. And we fought really hard for that. 2 years ago, we stood up and we said it's about time there were national admissions, and it's about time we were all very truthful about the academic standards that we were using to take students. Okay. On the percent plan, we didn't invent this. As you will know, there's a model like this in the US, the University of Texas, offered down to the top 20 students. It started as a political move. The governor said, you need to not turn your back on your local students. So they offered down to the top 20. They've been doing that for 15 years. They got pretty good data that their academic standards are just as good, if not better, and the diversity's improved. There's a similar model in Florida. There's one in California as well. So it has been pre-tested in different locations. I think it can be adapted in different ways. So there's lots of different steps in admissions in different universities. So it might not be that you make an offer to the top 3 or to the top 10 or the top 12, but what if you, in the US for instance, said, I'm going to make the SAT available for free for the top 20 students in every school in this constituency. Now, the Brookings Institute have done that, and they found more students qualified to go to university than they ever thought possible. It could be that the Oxford entrance exam, the same thing happens. So you don't have to make it a point of entry decision. It can just be, I want the top 3 or the top 10 to actually engage with us in this step. And it could be by borough, but we're a national university, so we obviously can't go down to top 20. There's 2,277 schools in Australia. Not all of them will want to come to ANU, we know that. If all of them did want to come, I'd be beside myself with delight, but they're not going to. Some of them will say, I don't know where Canberra is, I've never heard of you, I don't like Canberra. Fine, I can live with those decisions, but they should have that choice. Some of those schools, we had a lot of debate, about schools with fewer than 5 students in Australia. There's over 150 of them. And so we said, what do we do? So we actually said top 3 or 2%, because we didn't want to discriminate against the really big schools. We think that's really important. Those schools are overwhelmingly rural, Indigenous schools. And so we said, you know, if you were to just put a lower threshold in, then you would then basically wipe out for consideration some of the students who most need tertiary education. So we've said all schools, and the minimum number will be 3.
Well, that means that if you only have 2, then you can only have 2, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah, exactly.
Ken, just to the sort of second half of Richard's question, which I think was about, you talked earlier about the sort of variable use of contextual data across the colleges at Oxford. Can you imagine something that's more systematic?
The problem is that in Oxford, it's a serious problem. The colleges will not relinquish control over admissions to the university. So it means you have 30 different institutions conducting admissions with all their different cultures and attitudes. I think the reality is that colleges that are doing more in this area are increasingly shaming those who are doing less. The political pressure in the UK is now enormous for universities like Oxford to open themselves up. we released all of our admission statistics a few weeks ago, and the reason we did that was that increasingly the colleges were being sent freedom of information requests by journalists and politicians, and many of us thought that it was undignified for this material to be dragged out of us in that way, and we should publish it, and we should take the blows when we deserved them. And there were plenty of blows, and I think that's a good thing. I think it's a good process. So I think the answer is that it's going to be much more difficult for us to drive change in the way that you have strategically across the university, because we don't control any more than that which is within our own college. But we can, by speaking out publicly and by making ourselves an example for this process that's increasingly seen nationally as being successful and is increasingly being noted successfully. We were cited in the government's own report on fair access to universities. The Education Minister cited Wadham in his evidence to the Education Select Committee in Parliament 2 or 3 weeks ago, and only last week the Labour spokesman in the House of Lords cited Wadham as a paradigm, and I think that puts pressure on the other colleges to do better. But I think it's very unsatisfactory in Oxford that the Central University, I believe, it's very unsatisfactory the Central University has so little control over the admissions practices of individual colleges, because some colleges are woefully inadequate in this. And they're not the poor colleges. There's no correlation between how much money a college has got and how active they are in this space. Some of the wealthiest colleges do little or nothing. But I think increasingly they're being shamed into action.
Marnie, you mentioned also in your opening that you had made the decision that ANU wouldn't have interviews, and you referenced other things. Can you talk to us a bit more about why not? And then Ken might like to contribute about the potential virtues of interviews.
So we do for Tuckle scholarships. They in fact have 6 interviews and 2 group interviews. So we do for that scheme. Yeah, it's harder to get a Tuckle scholarship than it is to get a job at Google, we say. It's a huge number of students, but we, for 2 reasons. The first is we can't, the labour of that for a huge group of people. We won't do that. That's not an Australian thing. The second thing is I think people felt very strongly, and I agree with them, that there's not sufficient research out there to suggest that that was such a powerful way of choosing people that you couldn't look at grades or other information. And people were particularly concerned about judging students on the colour of their skin, on their accent, on their surname, on what they wore to the interview. People were quite rightly concerned about those things and thought that they might get in the way of actually just looking at the academic potential and the contextual information that we have. And our view is that in our system, which it currently is as well, the information's preloaded in, and the students made an offer to the university, regardless of the school they go to, what their name is. So the computer just simply says you've met the requirement, you're now being made an offer. So that ability to screen somebody out on the basis you don't look like me, you don't talk like me, and Australians don't have the diversity of accents. So being an Australian in the UK is always wonderful because we're seen as a relatively classless group of people. There are some variations in Australia around vocabulary. And so I'm just very sensitive to the idea that a young person might turn up and that on grounds other than academic potential that they might be screened out. And our folks felt very, very strongly about that.
Yeah, when I arrived in Oxford 6 years ago, I was a little sceptical about interviews because there's obviously a risk that people recruit in their own image. There's a risk of all the things that Marnie described. Every year, so the interviews happen in December in Oxford, and every year I sit in on interviews randomly to observe the process. I think that certainly the way it works, seems to work in my college, is that the interview is used as a mechanism precisely to engage with and to drive the contextualization process. So it seems, from what I've observed, that the academics admission tutors are very, very well aware that some young people coming into the college to be interviewed will be very suave, very articulate, very well trained. They'll have been given mock interviews at school. They may have had private tutors helping them, and that seems to be stripped away in the assessment that people make of interview performance. And what I see in interviews is that the admissions tutors are trying to get behind that. And the other side of the coin, trying to get behind students who are inarticulate, who express themselves clumsily. And they're trying to get behind all of that to find that precious piece of gold, which is the potential, which exists beyond all of those rather ephemeral characteristics. And when I speak to fellows in Wadham, and in particular those who are most engaged with this process about not having interviews, their really passionate belief is that the interview process enables them precisely to discover more of these disadvantaged but stunningly able young people than they would otherwise. So sometimes they see the school reports and they see the written work and they think, oh, I just don't know if this young woman's got it. And then they see her in interview and they get past all of that and they see that she has. So I entirely can see the other point of view, and it may be that these sorts of things are different in a college context as opposed to a university-wide context. But my own strong belief is that certainly in my college, the interviewing process is a driver of social mobility. It's a driver of getting these kids, the ones that we want to reach, into the college rather than rejecting them.
Thank you. I think we've got time for one more round of questions. There's a gentleman here with his... We might even have time for two if we're quick.
Kim Rainsford. I'm a retired but emeritus professor at Sheffield Hallam University. And when I came here, as I'd been working in 6 countries and 4 continents, in a whole variety of different types of tertiary education institutions, ranging, for instance, from the University of Zimbabwe through to Basel, to the University of Basel. I'd previously been in Hamilton at McMaster University, where they had tedious and unbelievably unsuccessful, I think, procedures for screening students. It was horrendous, the effort that went into it. Every member of staff was required to examine these letters that came from students, very well-meaning students, and I think they were absolutely useless. So what you're doing, I think, is fantastic. When I went to Sheffield Hallam in '91, I was then appointed Professor of Biomedical Sciences. Now, I come from a very different background of more into the applied sciences, into the biomedical area and medicine and so forth. Well, Sheffield Hallam had just been granted university status. The hostility from our neighbours up the hill, as we would call it, at Sheffield University, a red brick university, was absolutely unbelievable. I had personal attacks in public and what have you. Yet the thing that I did do was I modelled to some extent what you were talking about. Marnie, if I may say your first name. And that was that I went round to all the local schools, because we had a dreadful time trying to recruit students at that stage. You remember there were caps at that point on our intake. And I went round to every school that I could, and I got my staff to go round to the students and to tell them what we did and what the future was for them in a very broad area, actually, in biomedical sciences. And this was, I think we were pretty successful in the end. We also raised our research profile considerably. Prior to my going there, they got a 1 in the RAE, and in 1996 we got a 4. And in 96 to 2000, that went up as well. The research undoubtedly helped considerably to give us a profile in the biomedical sciences, and the sense of that. But increasingly, I have become more and more aware of the importance of an education that will yield a job. And many people at that stage were talking about this. What will my son or daughter do in biomedical sciences? What is biomedical sciences? So I had a big job, and that job is still there, actually.
I think that really helpfully touches on Marnie's points about getting out to students, not expecting them come to you.
It is.
And also to the conversation we've touched upon, but perhaps not gone into enough detail around sort of student and graduate outcomes. So if we may, we'll come back to both of those topics. Thank you very much.
My name's Alistair Fisher, and after leaving the university in Canberra, I lectured in economics in Adelaide, where for some 20 years I was the chairman of the special entry scheme there, and also for several years the chairman of the Joint Matriculation Committee for South Australia, where we introduced many of the things that you're now talking about. Most of ours were based on the Broadway scheme in Sydney, and in which we would be able to get students from disadvantaged backgrounds, but not at such a low level that they wouldn't be able to cope. And that's one of the problems, of course, with Aboriginal entry in Australia as well, because they might be able to get entry because the entry is sometimes easy for them, but then they find that they just can't cope because there is no mechanism behind them, and you probably find that. But since I've been here, I was on the entry committee for economics at Trinity College in Cambridge for about 4 years, and in that case there was I've seen both sides of the question, and I can see all kinds of problems that occur with the Oxford University system, that there's so much difference that each of the colleges competes in rather dreadful ways with each other, as well as with the rest of the university. And I also live in an artisan suburb of London. In other words, they're skilled labourers, basically, on both sides of me and in almost every other place, except, of course, for the migrants, who are extremely well read, have extraordinary backgrounds, and whose children have real ambition, whereas the kids who come from the indigenous English don't have much ambition at all. None of their children go to university. None of them has been any thought that they will do so, and I think that might be one of the great problems that we have in this country at the moment.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm reluctant to seem rude, but I also want to make sure everyone has an opportunity
My question was, if the minimum number was 3, what happens if you only have 1 or 2 at the school?
Yeah, so it's 1 or 2.
Oh, that's all right then.
But they've got to meet the floor as well.
Yeah, all right then.
I would like to just take one for the team here and say the devil of devolution in our university was around the scholarships. So you've talked about the collegiate system where everybody's doing their own thing. We have one admission system, we have one accommodation system, we have a guaranteed bed for every student in the first year, no problem there at all. 212 scholarships being administered through 170 odd different scholarship application processes with little committees with Excel spreadsheets all across the university. So we have our own battle there. The great news around this project has been identifying all those scholarships and saying to everybody, I can fill those scholarships and I can get you the data that you need through a central process where you're represented, rather than the work of you setting up all these separate things here. I can actually help you to get a better applicant pool than you had before.
Thank you. Yes, please.
I'm Catherine Mackenzie. It's a question for both Marnie and Ken. You've both used the word immerse in terms of the ANU and the Oxford experience, and they're both increasingly residential experiences. To what extent, if at all, can this be done online? Can one immerse oneself in the online space? Because underpinning that is the possibility of scalability.
Thank you. And I think there was a question here. You've had your hand up for a while, I think. We'll come to you in a second, if that's okay.
Hello, I'm William Hurley, alumnus of Wadham. No, I just wanted to ask about, question really the concept of choosing 3 of the best people from each of the schools in Australia, because I'm just worried that could be a sort of contentious and iniquitous idea in a way, because I have no idea how you would grade the 3 people. That was certainly something which was never done when I was at school, which was a very long time ago. And some people were good at classics, some people were good at science, some people history. So I have no idea. It would have been absolutely impossible to say, you know, which were the three sort of best students in a school. And I just wonder if we're not losing sight of just the whole objective of what a university is. Isn't it supposed to be about scholarships? So don't the students have to be highly motivated, highly interested in doing those subjects? That must also be a part of it.
Thank you.
And,
okay, let's turn to Ken and Marnie. So a couple of themes there. Perhaps start with the closing comment there, which connects in some ways, Ken, I think, with your comments about this not being about not lowering standards. So I think if I can paraphrase, is there a risk that we compromise on quality?
No, there isn't. And someone else said there's no point taking young people into these universities who can't succeed there and are going to fail there, because it's cruel and it's a waste of time, money, resource, and it's a waste for them. So we are absolutely committed to the idea that the young people that we recruit will be people who we believe can thrive in the university in an intellectual sense. Of course, they can do all sorts of other things as well. They can go off and play sport and all that kind of stuff if they want to, but they have to be able to survive and thrive intellectually. They have to have the intellectual makeup. So we don't recruit young people out of a sense of pity. We don't think, oh, we need a few more people from this community here, so we'll take this lot because they might just about get by. We take the ones that we think are good enough to come to an elite educational institution, which Wadham College is. It's an elite institution for very clever, very committed students. And we're not interested in students who aren't very clever and very committed, because they won't thrive at Wadham. But we don't believe that we'll only find those clever and committed students amongst people from higher socioeconomic classes rather than lower, and we want to find them everywhere. We take about the same proportion of students who apply from private schools compared to the total number who apply from private schools as apply from state schools. We take about 7% in each category. As it happens, we get many applications from state schools because we're known as a college that will respond fairly to applications from students from those schools. So we are not about lowering scholastic standards or intellectual standards at all.
I'm really glad you asked the question, because it allows me to explain a slight structural difference in the way we do grading in Australia. So we have a thing called an ATAR, Australian Tertiary Admissions Rank, which is a percentile rank. The lowest you can get is 30. And that question about Indigenous students, we have actually taken we've got a tiny little foundation program for 7 students. It's absolutely tiny, for Indigenous students who've actually not been well enrolled at school. They've been given vocational packages or not been given good advice. And we actually have an outstanding success rate, and those students have a GPA at or above the ordinary student body, but it's tiny. The students who finish school in Australia get that ATAR, which is a percentile rank, and our offer is made on their percentile rank. Now, our median ATAR at the moment is 96.3. Yeah, so some of you are going, gosh, would I have got into ANU? And our lowest ATAR that we take is 80. So that's roughly the top 20% of students in Australia are eligible to apply. And that's the floor for this scheme. And 85% of students in schools across Australia in the top 3 get a score above 80. So the data's there to show that they are achieving that level, and there is a correlation between that ATAR and them sticking with university and completing. So as far as we can see, that is a low-risk proposition for people. Now, the scheme is also open to students who are ranked with an ATAR of 90 and above as well. That's our usual group of students. So those 2 groups of students come in through the door. I didn't mention the 90s because that's what we ordinarily do. What we're doing is adding that top 3 group as well.
And I just add, the demographic, my senior tutor tells me that the demographic in Wadham, which obtains the highest proportion of first-class honours degrees in their finals, comprises working class boys from the north of England, from comprehensive schools who are doing science subjects. That's the demographic which achieves the highest proportion of firsts.
Just for a final comment, and maybe keep it brief, I'm conscious I'm now sat between people and a glass of wine. This question of immersion interests me, and your finishing remark about scalability, because there's a risk, isn't there, that this works in a particular context, but is not transportable nor scalable. So on the sort of spectrum of, very intimate, intense, campus-based residential experience, a la Wadham, through to sort of online course, how transferable are these actions that we're talking about?
I'm so glad you asked me, and I don't know if I've got anybody here who's a graduate of Griffin Hall at ANU. Yeah, we have a virtual hall of residence available for students who are not living in residence. So it exists only in space. It's got a tiny little room on campus with a microwave, and that's it. It'll get a new room in our campus construction. It's got 450 students, and it does not exist in space. But in its digital world, it has corridors, senior residence, social club. It's got its own bar that doesn't exist. It's completely digital. So the students, it's been going about 10 years at ANU. It's oversubscribed by a factor 2 or 3. We are funding now a new postgraduate one that'll be coming very shortly. So yes, we do actually think you can provide an immersive experience, because some students actually don't want to live in residence. And so we said, we will build beds for anybody who wants a bed, but if you don't want to live on campus, there is this opportunity to join Griffin Hall. And the other colleges know Griffin Hall because it has the best sporting teams of all. They siphon off all the local superstars, and the other colleges hate it. And when it was first started, they were really anti the idea, but it's there to stay. It's a really, really interesting model, and it's cropped up in a few universities now in the UK who've actually copied the model.
But they're taught through online courses, these students?
No, they come on campus. We do have fully online programs as well. But these students basically have like a virtual Wadham, which is, so we don't do our tutoring in college. It's done across the university in our divisions. So it's basically their residential community doesn't exist in space.
I think there is enormous potential for institutions like Oxford and ANU, no doubt, to spread knowledge and learning through online courses. In fact, I think the fact that Oxford University at the moment has set its face against doing what many Ivy League colleges and universities in the United States are doing. So we don't do it, but I can see there's a lot of potential there, and I'm sure it's one of those policies that will change, and Oxford will start to do it. I think all institutions will do it. Within 10 years, the landscape's going to be completely different, isn't it?
And the digital bar presumably is good for the liver and good for the work ethic as well.
We're in good health outcomes.
Okay. The conversation will continue. Apologies to those colleagues who haven't had a chance to ask questions. Just a very brief sort of wrap up. There are 3 things I've taken from the conversation to leave on a sort of positive note, and then Chantel is going to guide us through to canapes and glasses of wine. I do want to hold on to this notion that Ken started with around this is not about the deficit model. This is about opportunity. My strong instinct is that ANU will get better and better on the basis of what you're introducing here. And I think the more we can encourage our policymakers and politicians to talk about this in those terms, the better. And Sally, to your point as well, of course, we inherit a responsibility if we promote access to making sure students can thrive. And it feels to me there's a fundamental question underneath this, which is the exercise here about helping poor students assimilate into dominant cultures which are unfamiliar, or about challenging the cultures to be more inclusive? I suspect it's a bit of both. And then finally, how wonderful to facilitate a conversation that is full of thought and reflection, but also full of very pragmatic actions and evidence and data and transparency. How refreshing. It seems to me the best institutions are about getting their own houses in order and introducing some of these really innovative activities at both Wadham and at ANU, but also using your convening power and evidence to inspire, or even, as Ken put it, put peer pressure on others to follow suit. So it's been a great pleasure. Would you join me in offering a round of applause to Marnie?
Well, alumni, a university's reach is really dependent on you. And whatever the breakthroughs in our research or however transcending our thoughts, what we've seen here tonight, it is when we apply practically and positively our science and ideas that we create change. So I ask you tonight to really think hard, talk to your alumni and friends, and really register your support with your colleges and universities to make the difference. I believe we can make a difference. Can we raise funds for scholarships? Yes, we can. Can we go out there and mentor students from diverse backgrounds? Of course we can. We can do that from this evening, and I ask you to engage with your colleges and your universities. You've shown by your presence tonight that you are up for it. So please look at our alumni web pages, our social networks, a plug for LinkedIn for the UK and Europe, alumni pages for the Australian National University. We will be holding a number of activities and opportunities for you throughout this year. And just to note that tonight was also part of the In Conversation series, where we are bringing thought leaders and experts to discuss and show how they're applying knowledge and ideas and collaborating. And it's really an opportunity for you tonight to come together, collaborate, to think about collaboration and also supportive projects such as we've heard about the scholarship schemes, etc. I'm excited, so please do stay connected. And I'd just like to thank a few people for this evening. There's been a tremendous amount of effort from staff, etc. I really want to call out Robert McCorkdale, our chair of the Foundation Board, who's volunteered for over 10 years for the Australian National University, and also Professor Martin Bureau, who is an alumni of the Australian National University and read the Vice-Chancellor's strategic plan, and obviously at Wadham thought there was a lot of connections and it really shaped the opportunity here for tonight for our panel. And now for more drinks and conversation. The bar is open, as they say, and the food, so please stay to mingle. And if we could give one last round of applause to our panel. And